Led Zeppelin, members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 4 diamond albums, 14 multi-platinum records. Their accomplishments are a mile long, but what's even more astounding is when you consider the relatively short period of time that Led Zeppelin was active as a band before they broke up, about a decade, and the rate at which they would release their first 4 albums, their most successful, 4 records in 3 years. Their debut self-titled album came out in 1969. Led Zeppelin 2 came out the same year. Led Zeppelin 3 came out in 1970, and their 4th record, which fans call Led Zeppelin 4 but is technically untitled, released in 1971. That 4th album from that series is the band's biggest yet, featuring record-breaking hits like When the Levee Breaks and, of course, Stairway to Heaven. Led Zeppelin would rack up history-making accomplishments in just a few short years, more than most artists do over a period of decades throughout the course of their entire career. And at the end of that decade, Led Zeppelin made the decision to move on. When a band announces they're breaking up or headed on a farewell tour, oftentimes the response is cynical from fans. We've seen time and time again an announcement has been made about a farewell tour only for the artist to come back in a few short years. We've seen it before with Kiss, we've seen it with Motley Crue, and even Ozzy Osbourne announced no more tours all the way back in the 90s. It's understandably difficult for these artists to resist the mountains of money promoters will throw at them to reunite and get back out on the road. Even Axl Rose and Slash reunited for the Not in This Lifetime tour. And if you're familiar with everything that went down between Slash and Axl Rose, it really wasn't supposed to happen in this lifetime. This makes it all the more interesting that Led Zeppelin has undoubtedly turned down some very major, earth-shattering offers from promoters to reunite. Through all of their success during that decade, there was also a lot of trauma. Today we're going to look back at the history of Led Zeppelin, how they got started, where they went, and where they are today. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Rockfeed for more videos just like this and breaking news and updates about your favorite musicians. Before we begin, here's a quick word from one of our sponsors. Today's video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. Now, if you've heard of Raid Shadow Legends before, you're probably aware there are over 600 champions to choose from. These are the characters you play with. But today I want to talk about one of the bosses you and your team will face. This is Hellraiser the Dragon. He's going to try to burn you with this fiery breath. Your best option for you and your team is to bring in champions with the heaviest damage possible in hopes of interrupting that breath attack. Now, Raid's added some big new items this month to the game, including Forge Pass Season 3, which includes a limited edition artifact set. Raid's bringing out some awesome champion skins for Madame Saris. But wait, here's the big news. Raid just released a super-powered legendary version of everybody's favorite champion, Death Knight. The whole Raid community has been waiting for this for a long time. The best part is, everyone can get him for free just by logging in. All you have to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and October 27th, and you'll add the ultimate Death Knight to your collection. Easy. Use the DK Rises promo code for a bunch of free items to instantly level up your new strongest champion all the way to level 50, 5-star Ascension. Raid came through big time for viewers of Rockfeed. You are going to get bonuses worth $30 by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. This includes a free epic champion, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, and 1 XP boost, plus an ancient shard. They're giving Rockfeed viewers $30 worth of bonuses to start out, so what are you waiting for? Led Zeppelin was founded in London back in 1968. Their founding lineup was the same lineup that went on to achieve all of their success, with Robert Plant handling vocals, Jimmy Page on the guitar, John Paul Jones on the bass and keyboard, and of course, John Bonham on the drums. When the band first formed, they were not called Led Zeppelin. They initially went by the New Yardbirds, and they signed a deal with Atlantic Records, who is still active today. In 1966 in London, local musician Jimmy Page was working as a session artist. He joined the blues band the Yardbirds as the bassist to replace musician Paul Samwell Smith, but he was only in that role for a short time, switching to lead guitar a short time later. The pre-Zeppelin lineup for the Yardbirds is quite legendary because for a period of time, both guitarists in the band were none other than Jimmy Page and legendary guitarist Jeff Beck. But of course, Jeff Beck wouldn't stick around long. He left the band in October of 1966. The Yardbirds wouldn't last long though, with the members of the band becoming weighed down by the grueling touring schedule. Their final show would be in July of 1968. But they had agreed to do several other performances, so the members of the band who were stepping down agreed to let Jimmy Page fulfill those obligations with different members of the band. With the Yardbirds still having a few touring obligations, Jimmy Page needed to hire several musicians to make these shows work. He knew just who he wanted on vocals, none other than Terry Reid. Unfortunately, Terry Reid wasn't interested, but he suggested an alternative. He knew a friend in a band called Band of Joy. The singer of that band was none other than Robert Plant. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant hit it off, and he still needed a drummer. Robert Plant suggested his bandmate in Band of Joy, none other than drummer John Bonham. It was shortly after that where bassist John Paul Jones would contact the band about the vacancy. He signed up, and there you have the origin of what would later become Led Zeppelin. In November of 1968, they signed their record deal with Atlantic Records. Reportedly, executives at the label had never seen the band perform before and merely signed them at the suggestion of British singer Dusty Springfield. The band reportedly got a sweetheart recording contract that gave them full creativity over their album releases, including when they come out, the album art, and all of the contents within the record. Zeppelin released their debut self-titled album on January 12, 1969. Later that same year, Led Zeppelin would release their second album, dubbed Led Zeppelin II. The recording process for this album was very interesting, as the band recorded in multiple studios in both Europe and North America while they were on tour. This would be the band's first album to reach #1 on the charts in both the UK and the US, and it's been certified 12 times platinum by the RIAA. Led Zeppelin would release Led Zeppelin III on October 5th, 1970. This album featured Immigrant Song and Celebration Day, among others. Led Zeppelin's untitled album, released about a year later on November 8th, 1971. Fans refer to it as Led Zeppelin IV. It's the band's biggest record, having sold more than 37 million copies. 37 million. And this album features, of course, some of the band's biggest hits: Stairway to Heaven, When the Levee Breaks, Going to California. This is their biggest record. This is when things really got crazy for Led Zeppelin. They were already well known around the world, touring through Europe, touring in North America, but selling 37 million albums is really hard to quantify. It's also not exactly common for a band to have that kind of success on their fourth album. You tend to see that on the first or second release, but this is how things went down for Zeppelin. They released 4 albums in about 3 years' time. It was during this time that Led Zeppelin was considered to be the biggest band in the world. They continued their heavy touring schedule and releasing new music. In August of 1975, Led Zeppelin was gearing up for a fall tour of North America, when, unfortunately, Robert Plant and his wife Maureen were involved in a very serious car accident. His wife Maureen reportedly needed a blood transfusion that saved her life. Because of this accident, Robert Plant faced a lengthy recovery process, and the band wouldn't tour in the fall of '75 or at all in 1976. This was at a time when the band was at their peak, outselling bands like Rolling Stones. Meanwhile, around this time in the band, guitarist Jimmy Page had reportedly begun using heroin. He addressed these rumors in an interview back in 2014. He said, quote, "I couldn't comment on that, just like I wouldn't comment on the relationship between Zeppelin's audience and drugs. But of course you wouldn't ask me that. You wouldn't ask me what the climate was like at the time. The climate in the 1970s was different than it is now. Now it's a drinking culture. It wasn't so much then." The interviewer at GQ then asked him if he had ever been to rehab for heroin. He said, quote, "How do you know I had a heroin problem? You don't know what I had or what I didn't have. All I will say is this: my responsibilities to the music did not change. I didn't drop out or quit working. I was there just as much as anyone else was." This contradicts previous statements made by Robert Plant, who said that John Paul Jones took over at the time on the band's final album in 1979 because Page was largely absent, a claim that Jimmy Page, of course, denies. With Zeppelin taking the year off for Plant to recover during 1976, the band came back in '77 for a major North American tour. The band even set attendance records at the Silverdome during an April 30th concert in Michigan. That show alone saw the band have 76,000 fans in the same venue to watch them perform. Unfortunately for Zeppelin, their tour wasn't all smooth sailing. After their show on July 23rd at the Oakland Coliseum in California, Zeppelin's drummer John Bonham and members of Zeppelin's team were arrested after a member of the promoter's staff was reportedly beaten during the band's performance. The following day would see Led Zeppelin's final performance in the United States, with their career coming to an abrupt end. Just a few days later, the band was checking into their hotel on July 30th for a show that was planned at the Louisiana Superdome. Vocalist Robert Plant received terrible and unimaginable news. His 5-year-old son had passed away from a stomach virus. Understandably, the band immediately canceled their tour, and questions had arisen about the future of Led Zeppelin. In November of 1978, Zeppelin would record their album In Through the Outdoor. In June of 1980, the band was performing a large show in Nuremberg, Germany, when the show had to be stopped in the middle of the third song. Drummer John Bonham reportedly collapsed on stage and was rushed to the hospital. By 1980, Zeppelin was ready to return to North America for their first tour since the one they had to cancel in 1977 after Robert Plant tragically lost his son. The band was rehearsing in September of that same year for their tour. Drummer John Bonham was, of course, on hand to participate in those rehearsals. An assistant for the band was picking him up and taking him to breakfast, where he reportedly had 4 quadruple vodkas, reportedly 16 to 24 ounces, with a ham roll. Bonham reportedly continued drinking heavily while he was at the rehearsal studio. The band finished up rehearsals that night, and they went back to Jimmy Page's house to go to sleep. Around midnight, Bonham had gone to bed. At 1:45 p.m. the following day, the band's tour manager and John Paul Jones found John Bonham deceased. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to vomit, and the ruling was accidental death. A few weeks after John Bonham passed away, on December 4th, 1980, the band released a statement announcing they had broken up. They wrote, "We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were. Signed, Led Zeppelin." Since the announcement of their breakup, Led Zeppelin has only performed a handful of times for very select performances. When they broke up, they were the biggest band in the world. It's rare for bands that break up to stay broken up, as we mentioned earlier. But as Robert Plant stated in a recent interview, he genuinely seems to have no interest in performing with Led Zeppelin ever again. When Zeppelin reunited for one performance on December 10th, 2007, it broke the Guinness Book of World Records for the highest demand for tickets for one music concert. Reportedly, there were more than 20 million requests to receive tickets to the one Led Zeppelin reunion show. All of this demand still exists decades after the band broke up. In a new interview with Robert Plant released this month in the LA Times, Plant was asked about the immense demand for Led Zeppelin to perform live. He said, quote, "Going back to the font to get some kind of massive applause, it doesn't really satisfy my need to be stimulated. With so many artists coming out of retirement to perform live, there's something to be said about a band like Led Zeppelin that lets their legacy speak for itself. Only 3 or 4 reunion performances in the more than 30 years since the band broke up, and still so much demand for the group to perform live. Robert Plant still performs live regularly, as does Jimmy Page. What's your favorite Led Zeppelin song? Let us know in the comments down below.